Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Sean Huggins and this is Europe with Hugs. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we are checking out Economist Explains Why Europeans Are Getting Poorer and Happier? Huh? So Americans are getting richer and Europeans are getting more poor, but Europeans are getting happier and Americans are presumably getting unhappier. Interesting. But before we get into that, if you haven't already, then please consider subscribing, leaving a like on the video, leaving a comment down below. All that good stuff is quick, easy, free, and it really helps the channel a lot. So thank you in advance. Anyways, though, let's waste no more time yapping and hop straight into it. How are Europeans getting more poor and yet also happier? Here we go.
This graph shows that after the Second World War, the income of the average European has gotten closer and closer to that of the average American in dollar terms. However, after the crisis of 2008, that picture has changed, as European incomes stagnated while that of Americans continued to rise. This has led to alarming reports by financial media that Europeans are getting poorer and Americans richer. And while some of that can be explained by Europeans working less, a new report by arguably Europe's most famous economist, Mario Draghi, claims that the main problem is that Europeans have become 20% less productive compared to Americans.
Whoa! Europeans have become 20% less productive than Americans. Interesting. I wonder how you would even calculate that. All right, let's continue.
This economic stagnation is a major threat to Europe's prosperity because it will prevent European governments from making much needed investments to deal with a rapidly aging population and increased outside threats. However, as a European economist who acknowledges that this chart is very real, I still had a nagging suspicion that a crucial piece of the puzzle was missing, because whenever I make videos about Western economies, it's usually the Americans that are complaining about the state of their economy.
This is true. I am definitely one of those Americans.
Not Europeans. Of course, me just looking at my comments is hardly scientific. But when I inspected typical quality of life statistics, such as the Human Development Index, life expectancy at birth, and self-reported happiness, which normally correlate consistently with GDP per person, this supposed massive impoverishment of Europeans versus Americans does not show up at all. This really got me wondering, what's going on? Did Europeans find the secret to having a good life without having money? No, the problem is that using this specific measure of GDP...
Oh, let me guess. I think that GDP per person is going up in America, but it's kind of being inflated by like the top 1% of earners in America, or like the top 5% of earners in America, or something like that, where those people are earning exponentially more than everybody else, and there's kind of no middle class, and then it's kind of mostly like people that are kind of just struggling to get by. There's no one in the middle, and then there's like people making hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year. So on paper, it looks like everyone's making a bunch of money, but in reality, it's a couple people making most of the money, and then nobody in the middle, and then mostly everybody just kind of getting by at best, maybe, if I had to guess. I don't know. That's my assumption, but let's see.
That almost everyone uses is very misleading, at least when it comes to comparing how rich Europeans are to
that looks nice.
Americans. To understand why, let's do a quick review of how economists compare economies. While economists have long been looking for an alternative, as of today, gross domestic product, or GDP for short, is still considered the best metric to compare how well off people in different countries are. In essence, GDP measures the value of all final goods and services produced in a specific country or region in a year. Now, while that misses a lot of economic activity, GDP actually tends to correlate really well with all sorts of different quality of life metrics. But while, for example, life expectancy in terms of years lived can easily be compared between two countries, GDP cannot, because countries often use a different unit of account for GDP.
Oh.
That is, the value of British goods and services are measured in British pounds, and while the Europeans mostly use euros and Americans use dollars. Of course, the easiest way to compare economies that use different currencies is to just use today's exchange rate to, for example, convert Europe's euro GDP to Europe's dollar GDP.
Right.
Indeed, this is exactly how this graph was produced by economists at the World Bank. And just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, when I compare economies on this channel, I most often use GDP in dollar terms, simply because the US dollar is the world currency. So if your GDP drops in terms of US dollars, your citizens have genuinely become poorer from a global perspective. That is, they can now buy less stuff on international markets. So if, for example, we want to compare the international power of two small open economies that trade a lot with each other in different currencies, dollar term GDP is, in my opinion, the best metric that we have. However, GDP measured in US dollars is less useful if we want to compare American incomes to those in Europe. You see, in such large economic blocks, only a small fraction of goods and services are actually traded across borders. For example, in the US, total imports were just 15% of GDP in 2022. On top of that, for many goods and services, transportation costs are so high that it is extremely difficult to trade them across borders, even if such products or services would be much cheaper in a neighboring country. For example, if I go to the local hairdresser here in Belgium, I pay 15 euros to get this specific haircut, and it is worth every penny in my opinion. Which is good because while I live fairly close to the Dutch border, traveling to the nearest Dutch hair salon would be way more expensive than 15 euros, especially if I take into consideration travel time. This is why economists often use getting a haircut as an example of a non-tradable good or service, where transportation costs are so high that international trade does not make sense at all. As you can imagine, the bigger a country or region is, the fewer goods and services will be tradable, as it gets more and more expensive to travel to another country for an alternative. Specifically, economists have estimated that non-tradable goods and services could be as low as 22% for a big country like the United States. In other words, while it may be simplest to use today's dollar-euro exchange rate to judge how rich Europeans are compared to Americans, the vast majority of the GDP of both regions is not directly impacted by this exchange rate because it is measuring mostly non-tradable goods and services. This is why, instead, economists often use the so-called purchasing power parity, or PPP for short, exchange rates, to compare the economies of big currency blocks like Europe and the United States. In essence, the purchasing power parity comparison of GDP looks at the prices of a representative basket of goods and services that includes both tradable and non-tradable goods and services. So PPP GDP compares the purchasing power that people actually have to buy most goods and services in their own country, rather than on international markets using the US dollar. Interestingly, if we use PPP GDP to compare European incomes to those of America...
This all makes sense so far, but I still feel like there is more to the story.
Americans, we will see that Europe is not falling behind where it really matters.
Okay, I guess I was right. Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to factor in the price of things, goods and services in your country, and how much you can actually buy with how much you make. Because in America, if everything is twice as expensive as in Europe, just for example, then it doesn't matter if Americans make almost twice as much as Europeans, because the actual purchasing power is not the same.
Indeed.
I'm
As you can see
smart.
here, while the average EU and UK citizens' share of PPP GDP is lower than that of the average American, who works longer hours, by the way, we do not see the same stagnation as we saw in the US.
So it's actually, in terms of purchasing power, it's actually been pretty much just kind of keeping up basically the same amount, not really losing ground, not really gaining any ground, just kind of the same gap for since 2008. Interesting.
Dollar GDP graph. But why this difference? Well, since the difference between US dollar GDP and purchasing power parity GDP comes from how they account for both prices and the exchange rate, we would expect that either Europe's inflation and or exchange rate compared to the US could explain why Europeans have gotten poorer in US dollar terms since 2008. And as you can see here, after the 2008 crisis, prices in the US have gone up considerably faster than in key European countries. However, as we can see here, for the case of, for example, the Turkish lira, a high inflation currency should lose value compared to a low inflation currency. So given that inflation was consistently higher in the US than in Europe, we'd expect the dollar to have lost value compared to the euro. However, if we look at this graph, we can see that instead, the low inflation euro has lost value to the high inflation dollar. While in 2008 you could roughly get $1.50 for 1 euro, today you can only get roughly $1.12.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
For that same single euro. So
wait a minute. That does not make sense to me. Shouldn't it be the other way? Shouldn't you be able to get more dollars for euros? What the frick? How is it going down? If inflation is going up, shouldn't you be able to get like $2 per 1 euro or something by now? What the heck is going on here?
So while this graph is correct, Europeans are poorer in dollar terms. Most Europeans have not really felt this because most of what they buy are so-called non-traded goods and services, which come from the continent itself, where they do not use US dollars. This can explain why quality of life metrics that usually correlate with GDP, like the Human Development Index, life expectancy, and reported happiness in Europe, are doing just...
Wait a minute, let's go back here. This is self-reported life satisfaction, or basically happiness. And here it says that the United States, I guess, has had higher self-reported life satisfaction than Europeans historically, which is not what I would have expected. Now, it looks like European life satisfaction is just slowly increasing over the past 10, 15 years, and it looks like United States happiness or satisfaction is decreasing kind of rapidly, I would say, over that same amount of time. So maybe in the next 5 years, maybe this will switch and maybe Europe will be more self-reported as happy than Americans. I don't know, but I still wouldn't have expected the United States to be more satisfied than Europeans. Then again, I guess ignorance is bliss. Maybe that's why.
Are doing just fine despite dollar value GDP stagnating massively compared to the US since 2008. But then, why are financial newspapers and politicians making such a fuss about Europe's economic decline? Well, I think it is mostly a matter of perspective. If you work for an international company, as a financial journalist, for example, you will genuinely feel poorer on your trips to the United States or when comparing yourself to your American colleagues. And if, like Mario Draghi, you are worried about Europe's place in the world that is rapidly becoming more hostile, dollar GDP also matters a lot. For example, Europe's new LNG energy imports will have to be paid for in US dollars. Finally, the fact that the dollar has remained so strong despite higher inflation could be a reflection of fundamental US strengths compared to Europe, such as its cheaper energy, younger population, and better business environment for the companies of the future. So yes, people are right to worry about Europe's diminished economic strength on the world stage. However, with this video, I've hoped to have convinced you that despite a popular narrative, Europeans have not gotten poorer than Americans, where it really matters, the purchasing power of its people.
All right. Wow. Interesting stuff. So basically, Americans feel like they are happier than Europeans, even though Europeans maybe have more purchasing power and do it with being able to work a lot less hours. And yeah, I don't know. That's just interesting data. I guess it depends who you ask and what data you choose to look at and care about. But that's what I got you guys for, the experts. So what do you think of the video? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. And again, if you enjoy the videos and you haven't already, then please consider subscribing, leaving a like, all that good stuff. But that's all the time that I have for today. So thank you guys so much for being here. And as always, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.